Hey guys, in this video we're going to be going over how you can take a broken power cord if you have one. And so in this case we've got a 3-prong that had one of the ends rip out, and now this is a cable extension, so it's getting a lot less power through it. So what you can do if you know how to solder, and I'm going to show you guys how, is take just any standard 3-prong other power cable like this and strip it to get, and we can see in here you've got white, green, and black wires inside here. So green, ground, white is neutral, and then the black wire is your hot wire. And what you're going to find is if you take one of these wires and you cut it very carefully, you can get out the individual wires. And in this case I also need this plug end of it, so I'm just going to cut off a decent amount of wire, maybe about here, and then solder on green to green, white to white, black to black on this onto here, so that I have a good power cable again. So instead of having to go buy another 50-foot extension cord, you can save yourself a good amount of money just by having a little soldering iron around and putting on a new end. So stay tuned and I'll show you what this looks like once we've stripped it down. So stripping the wire to get out the individual wires so you can actually solder onto them is pretty easy. What you do is you make a very small incision, and I'm using a box cutter to do this. And after you make that incision, basically you just keep pulling it and stretching the plastic around it to expose more and more wire. And as you do this, eventually you're going to be able to get the outer shielding to come out so that you can get access to the red, green, and black, green, and white wires inside. So do that, and then we're also going to be using, hopefully you have one of these. If you don't, you can just go back to your box cutter, use wire strippers, and pull off the wires to actually expose the copper where you're going to do the actual solder. Okay, and so once you have stripped down the wires and you've exposed all 3 of them, and then used the wire stripper to actually get the exposed copper, what I like to do to help me out a lot is first you want to twist it up just so that you keep the individual copper wires from fraying, and then I put a little hook into it like this, and I'll do the same on the other side of the wire that I'm going to be soldering. And finally you kind of just overlap the hooks on, and before I even put any solder in here, I have a decent mechanical connection between the 2 wires that we're going to be soldering. And people will see how there's a light blue wire here, and that's probably because the manufacturing company, or wherever country this wire was manufactured, followed a different protocol for these wire conventions. And so in this case what we have is a green yellow stripe, which corresponds to ground, a brown wire which corresponds to our line or hot wire, and we have the light blue which is our neutral wire. And so I looked that up on Google or Wikipedia, and so that's how I know. But point is we have 3 wires and this is gonna work. But yeah, do check what the actual mapping is for each one of these wires. You want to make sure and double check that light blue is indeed your neutral wire before you actually proceed with this stuff. But yeah, so we'll put this all back together and see how it works. Another key thing that a lot of people forget to do is put on some kind of shrink wrap. Heat shrink is a very common thing people slide on over the wires before they do this. I don't have any shrink wrap that is big enough for this particular diameter wire, so I'm going to do this the really old-fashioned way and just use a lot of electrical tape to handle this after I make these solders. But yeah, and then the other key thing to make note of when you're actually doing the soldering is if you need to desolder something, there's something called a solder wick, and solder wicks look a lot like this. They just soak up the solder as you heat up the wires. And so the trick to this is going to be heating up these copper wires and then you just flow in the solder, and it should absorb all the liquid solder when it's in the liquid state. And so you want to get a lot of solder in there so you get a lot of good contact between these two wires so that the flow of electrons will be very nice. You add heat right here and then you flow in the solder. I do recommend using the solder with the Rosen core because it is a lot better than the other cheaper solders you'll find out there. So get quality solder and you will have a good connection. Also, it's good practice to have some kind of shrink wrap around your tube, around your wire before you do the solder, so that after you're done you can slide it over. But in this case I didn't have any shrink wrap that was big enough, so I'm going to be doing this the old-fashioned way and just putting in a lot of electrical tape over this after I'm done with the connection, and hopefully that'll be a decent fix. But the better way to do this is to have shrink wrap and buy the appropriate diameter shrink wrap for this, and then you would use a lighter afterwards underneath it to get the shrink wrap to shrink, and then you would have a very nice connection that was also protected. So I hope this helps out you guys, and thanks for watching. So once we get all the solder back in place and tape over the individual connections so that we don't risk contacting the wires, if you do go the unfortunate route that I am going of using electrical tape, the final thing I like to do is just kind of do a pass over of this just to keep all this stuff together and help add some strength in case this cable gets pulled on. But if you've made it this far, you're pretty much done. You just finish taping over it like this to make it look pretty and keep everything together, and you're done. So well done, and thanks for watching.